The medieval period is not just a period of time. It has entered the collective imagination as the playground of fantasy and historical literature. It is just recent enough to feel relevant, and just far enough back to still feel like magic. But medieval-based storytelling, particularly the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, would not have been possible or nearly as popular without the revelations made nearly 100 years ago at the Sutton Hoo archaeological site. This 1,400-year-old grave opened the world's eyes to a place and time that had previously been written off as primitive and unimportant. It's integral to our understanding of history and to our understanding of the storytelling tradition that stretches back all the way to the days of the ancient Anglo-Saxon kings. So I hope you're ready to indulge me today as I tell you about the Anglo-Saxon ship burial at Sutton Hoo, the history of its discovery, the history of the man and culture that were buried there, and the contemporary impact of this ancient find. The 19th and 20th centuries were a really good time to be a history nerd. You had the pseudo-medieval Victorian art and fashion revival, the Brothers Grimm were recovering cultural history through folk tales, philologists were using language to do the same, and there was a small but mighty contingent of scholars determined to turn over the long-settled stone of Anglo-Saxon history. The Anglo-Saxon period of English history, which lasted from roughly the 5th century to the year 1066, is a very misunderstood part of history, especially before the 20th century. And this is because after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there's a very steep drop-off in the written historical record. What we do have are scattered, very generalized accounts of wide swaths of history, often written decades or centuries after the events actually happened, and most of these resources weren't even written with the intent to be historically accurate. It would be like if 1,000 years in the future, the only first-hand evidence we had of the history of the 2010s was a singular tweet about Harambe published in 2025. Historians extrapolated what they could, but from the medieval period onward, that whole period of time, the early medieval period, was dismissed as the Dark Ages, and they assumed that if anything important or culturally relevant had happened during that period of time, someone would have written something down about it. And they didn't write anything down, so... But at the turn of the 20th century, scholars began diving back into what scant resources we did have, trying to uncover what actually happened during the supposed Dark Ages. And this would be challenging and relatively unfruitful work until that fateful summer of 1939. People had always known that there were barrows at Sutton Hoo, and this was not a particularly unique feature. There were barrows all over England of varying age and importance, and it was assumed that a lot of them had already been emptied out or picked over by grave robbers years before. So, in all likelihood, Colonel Frank Priddy didn't purchase the Tranmere house on the Sutton Hoo property because of the burial mounds, but they would end up being very important to his legacy. Frank Priddy died less than a decade after purchasing the property, but it would then be inherited by his widow, Edith Priddy. Following the death of her husband in 1934, she found comfort from her grief in spiritualism, speaking to the spirits of the dead, which was quite popular at the time, and she also found herself fascinated by the ancient burial mounds that she could see from the windows of her property. According to some stories, she was directed to the mounds by her nephew, who had used dowsing rods to determine there was gold in the hills. According to other tales, she saw ghostly apparitions in the hills at night. But honestly, I credit it mostly just to pure curiosity. Edith Priddy was no stranger to archaeological curiosity. As a kid, she had gone to see the pyramids at Giza, her father had excavated an ancient monastery, and it was pretty common for landowners at this time to put money into investigating the strange barrows that were on their property. In 1938, Priddy was put in contact with the man for the job, Basil Brown, a local self-taught archaeologist. What Brown lacked in actual experience, he made up for with pure enthusiasm and dedication, and with the promise of room and board and a payment of 30 shillings a week, he got to work. The first official dig at Sutton Hoo began on June 20th, 1938, which is exactly 87 years to the day before this video came out. And no, I didn't plan that, and yes, it did feel really weird once I found out that coincidence. Mrs. Pretty originally wanted Basil Brown to start on the largest mound, which is now called Mound 1, but after sticking a stick down into the dirt for a while, Basil Brown was not particularly hopeful about the prospects of Mound 1, and so he began with some smaller ones. Initially, he found nothing, and so he kept moving on, until on July 2nd in Mound 2, he found what looked like an iron rivet. He found more of these rivets, and eventually he discovered that these were laid out in the general shape of a small ship. However, all of the things that may have been inside the ship were either lost or stolen because the grave had been previously opened before, and so he had to move on to the next mound. In Mound 4, he found even more promising things: cremated human and animal bones and scraps of fabric, but it was all in pretty bad condition. By the end of the 1938 season, they knew that what they were finding was probably Anglo-Saxon or early medieval in origin, but it was hardly groundbreaking work. But it was enough of a discovery for Basil Brown to come back for a second season in 1939, and finally he was determined to get a start on Mound 1. With the help of Edith Pretty's gardener, John Jacobs, and her gamekeeper, William Spooner, they cut a deep trench into that mound, and on the 11th of May, Jacobs was the one to come across an iron rivet. Brown was certain that this rivet had come from a large ship, and so they kept digging, and soon they found 5 more rivets, 6 to 9 inches apart, and all in a row. It may have seemed coincidental to most eyes, but Basil Brown had a hunch that what he was looking at was the outline of a massive ship. The soil of Sutton Hoo was so acidic that most organic material, wood, plant matter, much less human flesh and bone, couldn't survive very long, not the thousands of years that it had been sitting there. So the wood of the ship was long gone, but it had left its imprint in the sandy soil. Carefully, inch by inch, Basil Brown and his amateur team began hollowing out the insides of this ship. They learned that the grave had previously been robbed, but the robbers didn't disturb it too much, and they didn't dig deep enough to find anything of special importance. And they certainly weren't going to recognize a couple rows of rusty bolts as the treasure that Basil Brown knew it was. The ship they uncovered was 27 meters, almost 90 feet long, a full-sized Viking ship interred thousands of years ago. Word quickly spread about this very unusual find, and soon they were being swarmed by scholars, archaeologists, and curious onlookers. The British Museum itself ordered Basil Brown to stop his work immediately so that they could bring in a team of more legitimate archaeologists. But assembling that team would be far from easy. After all, this was 1939, and World War II was just on the horizon. And with war brewing, the British Museum was getting busy with taking all of their precious, irreplaceable artifacts and putting them in storage somewhere safer than London during the Blitzkrieg. The discoveries at Sutton Hoo were very cool, but they were hardly people's largest priority. For 4 weeks that summer, Basil Brown kept on working at Sutton Hoo, even though it was unauthorized and he was not supposed to be doing that, but it may have been more of a blessing than they knew. Now that news about the site was out, there was a really big risk that the site would be taken by amateur archaeologists or by grave robbers, who were not going to be nearly as careful as Brown was, so it was a very good thing that he was keeping an eye on it. On July 8th, archaeologist Charles Phillip was put in charge of the continued dig, and Brown reluctantly but politely handed the site over. Phillips brought in a hastily gathered crew of archaeologists, dragging some in off their holidays to come work on the site, and some folks from an archaeology magazine came and took pictures of the ongoing dig. And then, on July 21st, archaeologist Peggy Guido discovered the first true treasure, a little ornate golden pyramid with garnets on it. and this was just a taste of what was to come. By the next day, they were finding golden, jewel-encrusted buckles, ornate purses, gold plaques, and coins. Martin Carver recounts. That night, in the Bull Hotel, which served as the excavator's base, Piggott remembered being asked the inevitable question, "Well, old boy, found any gold today?" "Oh yes," I said. "My pockets are absolutely full." And as I spoke, I was holding the box containing the great gold belt buckle in my rather sweaty hand in the pocket of my coat. And, "Oh," they said, "that's splendid. You must have a drink." "Yes," I said. "I need one." Armed only with whatever makeshift tools they could scrounge from Mrs. Pretty's home, fire bellows from her fireplace, buckets and basins from bedrooms, even pastry brushes, they began uncovering a veritable treasure, both literal and historical. They packed their finds away in little sweet bags that they got from the shop down the road or in old tobacco boxes, and stored this treasure in Tranmere House. It took them over 2 weeks to empty out the main burial chamber, and although they found all the trappings of a great lord, the clothing, the armor, even scraps of a great iron helm, there is one thing that they were missing: the body. There was no body, or even obvious evidence of a body, to be found in the Sutton Hoo burial. This initially led to the idea that it might not have been a grave at all, but just a kind of memorial for someone, but since then it has been confirmed that there most likely was a body at one point. It was just long since dissolved by the acidic soil that had also taken the ship. By the end of July, the discovery of the treasure had been made public, and the media swarmed in. Mrs. Pretty had to hire 2 policemen with her own money to stand guard lest the dig be interrupted until their finds could be shipped off to the British Museum on July 31st. It had been generally accepted knowledge that people in the Dark Ages had lived and died, but the finds at Sutton Hoo gave context to exactly how they lived and died. This was no savage warlord barely clinging to life through the Dark Ages. Sutton Hoo showed that there was culture and art and wealth that was utterly unheard of for this period of time. The grave contained plenty of everyday objects: iron cauldrons, wooden buckets and tubs, bronze bowls, and drinking horns, many of which were likely filled with food at the time of the burial. And then there was jewelry and clothing, solid gold belts, shoulder clasps, and strap ends, all decorated with gems and intricate scrollwork depicting representations of animals. There were spears and shields, coats of mail, and of course, the helmet. The legendary iron helmet found at Sutton Hoo had long since dissolved into fragments by the time that they found it, but there have been multiple efforts made at reconstructing it accurately. The first came in 1945 by Herbert Marion, but they didn't think that his proposed shape was quite accurate to what they already knew about Anglo-Saxon helms. They gave it another go in 1970, being very choosy with what they included or excluded. They left out any of the fragments that they couldn't place with relative certainty, and although this made for a much looser framework, it is regarded as being a fair representation of what the helm probably originally looked like. Based off of this reconstruction, a helmet was created, showing it in all of its supposed glory. Martin Carver describes, "The basic structure was of iron, but decorative panels of bronze were secured to sights on the face mask and cheek pieces by riveted bronze strips. The bronze was tinned and would have had a silvery appearance, imitated in the replica that was made by Tower Armories. In a startling symbolic composition, a snake body provides the protective rim across the crown. Its beady garnet eyes and gaping mouth meet the beak of a fierce bird, whose wings make the eyebrows, whose body forms the nose, and whose tail forms the mustache of the implacable human armored face." This wasn't just armor for simple physical protection. This was cultural or spiritual protection, clearly something that someone of very high station would have worn. And this was not the only piece in the collection that suggested some kind of royalty. We found what we've decided to refer to as a scepter, an unused whetstone with intricate decoration, an iron stand believed to have once held banners, and fragments that suggest a beautiful wooden harp. And perhaps the most intriguing artifacts found at Sutton Hoo were the ones that weren't Anglo-Saxon at all. Quite a few of the artifacts were determined to have been created in the Mediterranean: a large silver dish from Constantinople, ladles and bowls inscribed with the name of Saint Paul, a purse full of coins from France. These implied not only a curious flavor of Christianity within this very pagan burial, but also a level of communication and interconnectedness and trade with the larger Mediterranean medieval world than most scholars had ever thought possible. The finds at Sutton Hoo didn't just imply that Anglo-Saxon culture was further along than we had previously thought. It also implied that they were connected to the larger world in a way that we had never known about before. The spark of Sutton Hoo was suddenly making the Dark Ages not look quite as dark. Of course, with a treasure like this, not just historical, but also monetary, worth probably millions of dollars, there was always going to be a bit of legal debating over ownership. On August 14th, 1939, the artifacts were brought back from the British Museum to the Parish Hall at Sutton for an inquest. You see, there was a very old law, technically still in effect in England, that claimed that if an inquest could prove that buried treasure was placed in the ground with the intent for someone to come back and get it, that buried treasure would go to the crown. We don't know exactly how this law came about, but most likely it comes from the idea that if someone is burying money, it's because they're trying to avoid taxes. And so when that treasure is found, not by the people that put it in there, but by other people, it should be given to the crown because it was stolen from them in the first place. However, if you could prove that the treasure was put in the ground without the intent to come back and fetch it at a later date, then the treasure would go to whoever owned the property that it was found on. At the Sutton Hoo inquest, they pointed out that this archaeological site predates England and English law by quite a bit, so the laws didn't really apply in this case. They also pointed out that this was a very high-effort kind of ordeal that would have required a lot of manpower, and if there was someone there that had wanted to go back and get the treasure, it's not like they would have forgotten where it was. Everybody knew exactly where the treasure was, and they didn't get it, which implies that they probably meant for it to stay there. And then they also pulled in the historical context, that there were a lot of burials with grave goods from Central Europe during this time, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that these practices came over to England with the Anglo-Saxon invaders. So it was that the inquest granted the treasure to the landowner and not the crown, and all of the Sutton Hoo finds went to Edith Pretty. And I truly cannot express how much I admire this woman. She is so cool, because there must have been so much pressure at this point placed on her. But you know what she did? She took all of this treasure, millions of dollars worth of gold and so much historical information, and she donated all of it to the British Museum, no strings attached. And to this day, that remains one of the most generous singular donations that they've ever received. We certainly shouldn't forget any of the folks involved in this first dig, Basil Brown or Charles Phillips, but I truly hope that Edith Pretty's name will forever be linked to the Sutton Hoo finds, because her determination and her curiosity is the reason that we have that today. Although all of the grave goods were certainly carted off to safety, the site itself in the coming years did not fare so well. In the Second World War, there were anti-glider ditches dug into the landscape that were so deep that you can still see some of them today. In 1965, the British Museum sent out another team to do a reinvestigation of the site, and this time they found more than just Anglo-Saxon remains. There was evidence of a Neolithic man-made ditch, a Bronze Age palisade, and artifacts likely left by the Beaker people. They had very strong evidence that this area had been inhabited and cultivated by humans for easily 4,000 years. There were also more contemporary discoveries made, such as a series of medieval graves found in and around the existing mounds. site. By the end of the 70s, archaeologists were raring to get back to Sutton Hoo to apply their new archaeological techniques and tactics to the site. The idea was left kind of in limbo, getting batted back and forth for a while. They were trying to determine if another dig would be beneficial or if it would do more damage to the site, because archaeology is kind of inherently harmful to historical sites, so they didn't want to go back unless they had a really good reason to go back. But finally, in 1983, permission was granted, and a team led by Martin Carver was brought back to Sutton Hoo, where they found it in a condition which Martin Carver called catastrophic. It was overgrown and riddled with rabbit warrens, and they had to do about 10 years of work in order to get the site up to their standards. They resurveyed the area, they jotted down the size and composition of all of the mounds, and they discovered some new points of interest. Among discovering some Anglo-Saxon horse burials, they also found multiple medieval graves, which implied that the victims buried had been executed. Some were decapitated, many were disfigured, and some of them had the gallows that were the cause of their death right on the ground next to them. Both the bodies and the gallows long since swallowed up by the sand of Sutton Hoo. We'll never know exactly why medieval people were inspired to use this as an execution site, but it was clear that Sutton Hoo had been a place of special importance for locals for centuries, for thousands of years. In the 90s, the site was handed from private ownership to the National Trust, and other than constructing a visitor center in the early 2000s, which required a bit of excavation, and they did discover some cool medieval graves, but for the most part, the site has remained untouched until the 2020s. Sutton Hoo is a really interesting paradox because it leaves so many mysteries, so many things unexplained, while also filling in so many gaps in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. And so now I am going to do my very best to give you a crash course on the history of Anglo-Saxon England so I can show you where Sutton Hoo fills those gaps in. Britain, as a collective, had been inhabited by humans for hundreds of thousands of years, but their society got a hard launch into modernity with the takeover of Rome. After a brief but brutal battle, Rome claimed the territory from its native people, bringing in their infrastructure, soldiers, and religion, taking over most of the southern half of England by the end of the 1st century. They ruled for 350 years, but by the end of the 4th century, their hold was beginning to wobble a bit. And this is not the video where I'm gonna get into the fall of the Roman Empire, because that's way too much to discuss here, but for all intents and purposes for this discussion, Rome was simply stretched far too thin. They covered such a wide swath of land that their army simply couldn't be in every place at once, and so as they faced increasing heat on their eastern flank, they pulled soldiers out of the west, out of Britain, to accommodate for that. And soon the number of British soldiers had dropped to 1/3 of what it was at the height of Roman occupation. Britain was being struck by the Scots and Picts to the north, stung by sea raiders from the mainland, and by the beginning of the 5th century, Rome pulled all military and cultural support from Britain. Their economy, infrastructure, and society collapsed. This was overall a terrible time, obviously. The collapse of society is rarely a fun thing, but Britain was fortunate enough to be experiencing notably higher temperatures at this point, meaning that their farmland was flourishing. Less fortunately, temperatures weren't just higher in Britain, they were higher globally, meaning that the ice caps were melting, the seas were rising, and places like Denmark, Holland, and Belgium were experiencing a lot of flooding. The people from those countries needed a place to go, and England was looking rather fertile and like they had some good harvests going, and so a lot of people from those countries were coming over to England. Historical accounts report that Britain actually invited the Saxons into their country because Rome had very often hired them as mercenaries, and so why wouldn't the Britons do the same? Hire the Saxons in to come and defeat their northern neighbors to give them peace once more. As the story goes, the Saxons fought off the Picts and the Scots, and then they turned around to Britain and just took over the entire country. Now, is this account true, historically speaking? We just don't know, as with many historical sources from this time. It was written long after these events, and without necessarily the intent of being historically accurate. It was meant to, tell a story and to make a point. However, we do know that by roughly 430, many settlers from the main continent had made their way over to Britain. And this wasn't just three separate clans, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, that were coming over to invade Britain, but also the Frisians, the Swedes, and the Franks. They were all working together to invade Britain, and these cultural clan lines were not super distinct. And it's interesting that the first archaeological evidence we have of these mainlanders coming over to Britain is actually from their cremations. Cremation was not practiced by Britons at the time, but it was popular in the mainland tribes, along with the burial of animals and grave goods like jewelry and weapons, which also enter the archaeological record of Britain around the 5th century. Now, this was hardly a planned invasion. It was basically just waves of settlers coming to Britain, and the native Britons tried to fight back, but were for the most part either killed, driven out to Wales, or they assimilated into the culture of these new clans. But by the mid-500s, we see the emergence of strong singular leaders, and what can loosely be considered kingdoms. Popular teaching says that these clans then settled out into 7 kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, each ruled by a different people. But this is less a historical idea and more of a tradition. While all of these kingdoms did most likely exist at one point or another, there was no singular point in history in which all of them ruled equally, and the divides between clans were not so clear-cut. Either way, we are fairly certain that by the mid-500s, charismatic singular leaders were taking over tribes and becoming what we now consider kingdoms. Around 570 in the archaeological record, there is a sharp decline of elaborate furnished burials, suggesting that perhaps this activity was restricted to particular important members of society. The record also shows that rather than dedicating their time to building homes and farms, people were taking more and more time to build bigger and better and grander structures. They weren't just creating a village, they were creating a kingdom. They wanted something to be proud about. We don't know exactly why, when, how, or who, but we do know that by the end of the 6th century, there were kings in England. And it was just decades later, in the mid-600s, that the man buried in Sutton Hoo lived and died. And the unfortunate reality is that we cannot and will never know exactly who is buried in the Sutton Hoo grave. But the most popular idea is that it is King Radwald, the king of East Anglia, in the late 6th or early 7th century. Next to nothing is known about King Radwald, except that he is from the dynasty of the Wulfengas, that he protected King Edwin, the future king of Northumbria, and that at some point in his life he had a run-in with Christianity. Christianity had existed in England and was practiced in England since the days of Rome. They were the ones who brought it over, but with the sudden influx of German pagans, paganism did become the dominant religion during the Anglo-Saxon period. So Christianity existed, and there were certain people preaching it, but it was not the dominant faith. But King Radwald, on a visit to Kent, was swayed to the ways of Christianity, and it's believed that he brought this back with him to East Anglia. Upon returning to East Anglia, he did revert to paganism, but throughout the rest of his life, he kept 2 altars, one pagan and one Christian. And while that is all of the biographical information we have about King Radwald, it is plenty of evidence to put him right in the crosshairs of Sutton Hoo theorists. First off, the timelines match up. It is believed that King Radwald died around 624, and the coins that were found in the Sutton Hoo grave do imply that the grave is from around that time. In the grave, we also find those silver bowls inscribed with the name of the Christian Saint Paul, meaning that there is quantifiable evidence of both Christian and pagan worship, which quite well fits what we know of Radwald. Of course, we can't even say for certainty that the person buried in this grave was a king, and there have been arguments made that he may not have even been Anglo-Saxon, But the level of wealth and the time commitment it would have taken to perform this burial, at the very least, we know that this was a very special person. Plus, there is the point that this is a ship burial, and ship burials were not common in Britain, but they were fairly common in Sweden. And for all we know, the Wolfingas dynasty descended from Sweden, and perhaps this was a practice that they took with them when they crossed over the sea, as a way to hint towards their Swedish pride. Realistically, there's just absolutely no way to prove definitively whether or not King Radwald is the person buried at Sutton Hoo, unless somebody from 625 is willing to step forward with some first-hand information, but the reality is that it kind of doesn't matter. As far as we're aware, he is our best bet, as Mark Morris puts it. Sometimes archaeology and history fit together well enough that the most tempting conclusion also happens to be the correct one. But frankly, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter who was buried there. And the fact that we don't know, and the fact that this is a mystery that can never be answered, I think has actually helped its case. Humans love a mystery. They love to be left guessing, and Sutton Hoo is just evocative and just elusive enough that it has cemented itself into the cauldron of story. Most notably, Sutton Hoo marked a revolution in the public perception of Beowulf. Just like Sutton Hoo, Beowulf is a one-of-a-kind relic of a long-lost period of history. Although the extant manuscript of Beowulf dates from around 1000 AD, the original story that it tells is believed to be much older. An English tale of a Swedish hero fighting a Danish monster, Beowulf seems to encapsulate the contours of history, the Germanic tribes taking their stories over to England. It also uniquely encapsulates the very significant shift around the year 1000 from paganism being the dominant religion to Christianity being the dominant religion. It is an inherently pagan story, with a backbone of these old world beliefs, but there's a core of Christian theology that's impossible to ignore. It's just like King Radwald, taking something from both the pagan and the Christian world on his journey into the next one. There are even entire passages in Beowulf that seem to describe the burial at Sutton Hoo to a T. Early in the story, they describe in exquisite detail the funeral of the great lord Scyld Scefing. They stretched out their beloved lord in his boat, laid out by the mast amidship, the great ring-giver. Far-fetched treasures were piled upon him, and precious gear. I never heard before of a ship so well furbished, with battle tackle, bladed weapons, and coats of mail. Of course, Scyld's ship was sent out to sea and not interred, but other than that, it feels kind of like a how-to manual for the burial that we saw at Sutton Hoo. And while technically speaking, the burial at Sutton Hoo and the extant manuscript of Beowulf are over 400 years apart in the historical timeline, they seem to come out of the same world and the same worldview. And both of these, Sutton Hoo and Beowulf, gaining popularity in the mid-20th century was key to our contemporary understanding of Anglo-Saxon culture. And from their very earliest days in the public perception, Beowulf and Sutton Hoo were entangled. As Roberta Frank puts it, Sutton Hoo in 1939 lit up a bit of Dark Age Britain. Beowulf responded like a moth to a flame, and nothing has been the same since. The story goes that during the inquest, when they were trying to determine who the treasures of Sutton Hoo should belong to, they actually quoted lines from Beowulf as evidence that this was a funeral rite and not simply a memorial. Now that story isn't true, it was something just made up in the 40s, but it proves that from the 40s onwards, at least, there was a desire to link these two stories. This association kept popping up in news stories, in archaeological write-ups, the one used to illuminate and revitalize the other. Beowulf had long been in the public consciousness. Go ahead and check out the full video that I made on it for more information on that. But in the early 20th century, it was undergoing a bit of a renaissance. People were realizing this wasn't just a scrap of stuffy nonsense poetry. It was a lens into another world, a world often ignored by historians of the past, and a world that Sutton Hoo had just opened the doors to. And on Sutton's Hoo part, it suddenly had a story. Though the body was long gone, the soul of the man was brought to life in the imagination of a generation just learning that the Dark Ages may have looked a lot lighter than they'd ever imagined. And this also coincided with the emergence and popularization of the fantasy genre, which of course in the mid-50s had J.R.R. Tolkien at its head. Tolkien had had a lifelong fascination with the stories of old Europe. Finnish and Norse myth was the compost of his imagination, and the early medieval period was his playground. And at the heart of all of this was language. Tolkien was fascinated by the way that you could find history in the roots of language, and the linguistic complexity found in the Silmarillion, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and all of his other works is rooted in his love of old European languages and the stories that these languages told. In his landmark essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien rails against the popular scholarly thought of the day, which dismissed Beowulf as being invaluable because it didn't tell a real story. For Tolkien, the monsters and the fictional heroes that slayed them said just as much, if not more, about the people that told that story than any history book could hope to. And while Tolkien never commented on Sutton Hoo, we can be certain that it was on his radar. For one, it was exactly up his alley, and he also subscribed to an archaeological magazine, and when an issue came out about Sutton Hoo, he was quite excited to read it. The burial ship brought this period of distinctly English history to life just as much as Beowulf did. This wasn't just people staggering around in the dark, waiting for the spark of the Renaissance to light them back up. This was a rich and complex culture, capable of storytelling, of fantasy, of imagination. This is the kind of people that would inter lifetimes worth of riches in a boat in the ground just because their imaginations told them that was the right thing to do. Even back then, they were creating stories that we are still reading, telling, and untangling today. In fact, we're still working on cracking open the mysteries of Sutton Hoo almost 100 years after they were first discovered. In 2014, an investigation was made into the nearby village of Rendlesham, which rests over what is likely an Anglo-Saxon settlement. They've discovered some very convincing links between this village, its proximity, its size, and industrial scale that do suggest it had a link to Sutton Hoo. This is a big deal because it has long since been obvious that whoever buried people at Sutton Hoo, they did not live at Sutton Hoo. There was no evidence of a long-term habitation of anyone on the particular site of Sutton Hoo. So this opens up the possibility that people lived in Rendlesham and then went down the river a couple of miles to the sacred graveyard to bury their kings. Just this spring, only a couple months ago, the British program Time Team was given permission to get involved in another excavation at the site. They're specifically excavating the since unexplored garden field, and it's the largest excavation the site has seen since the 2000s when the visitor center was built. Very recently, they've released that they made a huge discovery, which is the long-lost bottom of the Bromswell bucket. Fragments of this bucket were first discovered in 1986, and it's a marvel of craftsmanship. Decorated with a North African hunting scene bearing a Greek inscription that implies it was a diplomatic gift, this bucket was one of many more curious international finds in the grave. But now that we've found the bottom of this bucket, we can finally learn what it contained, which is cremated remains. There are fragments of human bone, specifically ankle and skull, and cremated animal bones, and an uncremated comb, most likely made of antler. The conclusion is, due to the cost and the exoticness of the vessel in which this person was buried, they must have been someone of very high society, even though we have not been able to determine their gender. The curious combination of a rich artifact from the Byzantine Empire, used for a very northern European funeral style, buried in an ancient English graveyard, beautifully demonstrates the mysteries provided by Sutton Hoo. The Time team actually posts all of their stuff up on YouTube now, completely for free, so if you want any more info about Sutton Hoo and what they have going on there, both old info and their new discoveries, go and check out their channel because they have such incredibly cool stuff going. It seems that with ship burials and horses, bucket internments, and execution graves, Sutton Hoo is determined to keep people guessing for a long, long time. Although it's just a few acres of long-trod British soil, Sutton Hoo has changed the way that we perceive the past of storytelling, of fantasy, and of history alike. Sutton Hoo has lent a shape and a beautiful form to a part of history that we had thought long lost. And the whole site just reminds me of how foolish we are if we ever decide to look down on the people of the past. We have the same set of limbs, the same nose, the same mouth, the same eyes, the same minds that we have had for the last 300,000 years. We have been struggling, killing, thriving, and surviving for millennia. And if we dismiss people of the past as ignorant, unimportant, if we dismiss the past as a dark age of irrelevance, I'm sure that we can all see how history will repeat itself. I guess it's my sign to wrap this video up because lawnmowers have started and children have started screaming. For further information on Sutton Hoo, check out really any book by Martin Carver or anything written by Martin Carver. He's kind of the main voice on this subject because he's done a lot of the later excavations of Sutton Hoo. And then of course also check out the Time team for some really informative, really in-depth stuff about Sutton Hoo and, you know, about history in general. They just make good stuff. Now, as always, I've tried to do as much research in this video to get everything as right as I possibly can, but I actually never learned about the early medieval period in school, so all of this is very new to me, and I know some of you are much more up on this stuff than I am, so if I got anything wrong, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to correct myself in the comments wherever I went wrong. Also in the comments, tell me about your favorite archaeological site. I know that you have a favorite archaeological site because you're watching this video, and if you clicked on this video, you're that kind of person. Don't worry, I am too, and someday I will tell you about my favorite archaeological site. And go ahead and share this video with a friend who also has a favorite archaeological site. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and do consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talk about the art of storytelling, the Lord of the Rings, and whatever other historical things I want to talk about. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.